My name is Bryce Wilberding, and I'm going to talk about walleye production and profitability as a case study for US aquaculture. So we'll get down to this narrow problem, which is that profitability is a key barrier in the US recirculating aquaculture industry. And I approached this by modeling walleye growth and operating income as a case study and a tool for farmers in the upper Midwest, ultimately finding that walleye aquaculture is a promising local tool for a global seafood problem. But first, I'd like to thank my team. First, I worked with the team at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point North American Aquaculture Demonstration Facility. They're one of the leading researchers in recirculating aquaculture in the US. My advisor, Jim Leap, and then some background on me. I'm working on the Sustainable Food and Water Systems pathway. Also have a love for fish, and as of last week, I'm a father of 2, so thank you to my wife who can't be here. So big picture, this global problem is that seafood demand has been growing at around 3% annually since the 1960s, which is double population growth in that same period of time. And so while demand has grown, wild supply of seafood, which is where we've typically gotten our seafood, has stagnated, with around 95% of global fisheries at or above their maximum sustainable yield for harvest, which is the most they can be harvested at and still recoup their populations. So filling in that gap has been aquaculture. So aquaculture is essentially farming of fish or seafood for human consumption. Just in the past few years, we've hit over 50% of global seafood consumed is from aquaculture rather than wild capture fisheries. But in the US, we have a different problem where 70 to 85% of our seafood is imported, making us the #1 importer of seafood at around a $17 billion trade deficit. So in addition to some environmental and human rights concerns, this poses additional national food and economic security concerns. But the US aquaculture industry still hasn't quite taken off. And on the offshore side of things, that's largely due to regulatory barriers, which have risen over time. And then on land or onshore or in recirculating systems, it's financial barriers that have been the key constraint. So aquaculture broadly, you move from a brood stock through hatchery to a grow-out phase and then finally to market where the fish is consumed. I'm going to look specifically at the grow-out phase, which many of you might recognize as offshore net pens. Some other forms of grow-out for aquaculture are ponds, typically where carp and tilapia are raised, raceways where trout are commonly raised, and then recirculating aquaculture, which we'll dive into more today. So recirculating aquaculture is a method of fish farming in which water is recirculated and reused through a system, keeping around 95 to 99% of that water free flowing through the system. It allows for precision and control, decreases water usage, can be done in theory anywhere, localizing supply chains, and then importantly, there's a almost minimal biosecurity, biodiversity risk, but the main drawback is that it's capital and energy intensive. So I've focused specifically on walleye recirculating aquaculture. Walleye is a freshwater finfish native to the upper Midwest in the US and Canada, known for its firm white meat. It's a great eating fish. And then there are some issues with One, we have strong regional demand for the fish at a premium price per pound, which is essential when you're growing something for sale. And there's a limited and inconsistent supply. Most walleye today comes from lakes in northern Canada, where supply is both dwindling and inconsistent in the summer months. So we have this supply-demand balance. And then the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point has been raising walleye for over 15 years and has some great data and tools for farmers, but what we're lacking is that financial piece so they can understand how to be profitable. So when I say operating break-even, what I'm talking about is operating income, which is the income from a business in which you'll take revenue or sales from the business, minus COGS, which are cost of goods sold specifically allocated to the end product, minus operating expenses, which are the costs of running a business. And what we can do is, given that we know some of these variables, we can first solve for the minimum price to hit operating break-even, and then a minimum quantity as well. So I'll walk through first how we define our assumptions, model walleye growth, define our COGS and OPEX, solve for a minimum price, and then solve for a minimum quantity to hit operating break-even. So I promise this is the only Excel screenshot we'll look at, but I wanted to highlight some initial assumptions. First, that we're gonna look at an example with around 34,000 fingerlings being fish just over a finger long that are input in this system. We'll assume a 4% mortality rate through grow-out, which is standard through Stevens Point's research, up to 1 pound market weight, which is about the minimum you can sell walleye for. And then finally, I'd like to highlight our feed conversion ratio from our feed model, which is the amount of feed you need to produce the same weight of meat, which is one of the efficiencies of aquaculture. You'll see that's significantly lower than beef, pork, and chicken. So here is some outputs from our growth model. As you can see, we're starting with fingerlings around 40 days old and hit market weight around 440 days. So it's just over, a little over a year from fingerling to market size. And then we'll look at the cost that we've defined through this model. So we see that fingerlings, feed, labor, and electricity are some of the most significant costs here. And then finally, we're going to solve for that minimum sale price to hit operating break-even. So here we have break-even price per processed fillet, and then on the x-axis you have the starting number of fingerlings in this facility, which really starts to level off around $10 a pound is when you've hit economies of scale. But what's important to note is around $20 is the market rate. So what we want to do is we want to be below and to the right of that $20 market rate so we can make an operating profit. Now then, if we solve for minimum quantity given a $20 market rate, we can get a good idea of how many fingerlings we need to start with to hit our operating profit and beyond. So it's around 34,000 fingerlings based on this model that we start to make an operating profit growing out walleye for consumption. And the takeaway really is that walleye RAS may be profitable at mid-scale, but there are still some financial and operational challenges. And these are plenty, so I want to highlight a few of them. So first is fingerlings. We saw the price of fingerlings. It's kind of high at $2 per gram, but it's important to note there are only 3 producers providing fingerlings for walleye operations to date, so huge bottleneck. Feed is a bottleneck in any aquaculture operation. That will actually grow as a percent of costs as you scale. Energy is continuous concern in RAS aquaculture, which we can at least mitigate by moving to renewable energy sources. Increasing production cycles per year will help to spread OPEX. And then growth rate. Right now, all of our walleye broodstock are from wild sources, so they're not domesticated for fast growth in aquaculture facilities. And then finally, financing. A key constraint in this model is that we do look at CapEx as a depreciation line item, but don't model out CapEx beyond that, which is a pretty significant cost. So that's something we'll have to do in the future and find some more innovative financing sources. Are there any questions? And I'll leave this slide up because there's a lot.
Question on that, just because you didn't mention it and maybe it came up in some of the conversations, but are there any challenges in terms of like training people and the know-how to be able to do this in a decentralized way? Because that seems like one of the main benefits is that you can kind of do this anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I have it on one of the slides. I didn't highlight it, but one of the issues. So aquaculture as a whole is a relatively new industry. Salmon aquaculture, which is I think aquaculture's darling, first took off in the '60s, and recirculating aquaculture is much newer, right? So I think actually training and knowledge is one of the key constraints as well. So anecdotally, we've seen a lot of recirculating aquaculture companies fail at large scale and very publicly. And a lot of that can be attributed to just a lack of experience in moving to large scale immediately. So absolutely a constraint. I think that's where the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point is doing a great job creating these extension tools like this for farmers. So I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear more if there's any cost associated with antibiotic use or if there's more of a potential for fish in this system to potentially have disease or other things like that. And that's what I've heard. Again, I don't know if that's accurate, but how that might feed into some of this.
Yeah. So some aquaculture systems use antibiotics while others don't. One of the benefits of recirculating aquaculture is if you have a clean system, it's less of an issue. I think It really is case dependent, but I think the best case study to look at is Norwegian salmon aquaculture, who have moved almost entirely away from antibiotics in the last couple of years. So they're raising salmon to market size, full growth in ocean net pens without any antibiotics. So I don't have a specific answer for walleye wrasse, but it's certainly possible, and that's where I would look first.
Thanks, Bryce. Beyond biodiversity, I'm curious, what are the other benefits to, doing these aquaculture processes with many different species of fish versus just kind of focusing on salmon or whatever species and trying to scale it up to get that at a, low price?
So I think what we're seeing with salmon now, because salmon aquaculture has taken off in such a big way, is prices starting to depress as we see an oversupply in the market. So I think there is a case to be made for a diversity of species that you're starting to raise so that, one, you're not oversupplying the market and depressing your prices that make this profitable in the first place. Does that answer your question?
Any other benefits to just doing a lot of species within aquaculture?
Do you mean like in the industry as a whole? Yeah, I think there are takeaways from one species to another. And like I said, this industry is so young that any advancements like this, walleye aquaculture is niche, right? But any advancements you can have in one of these subsectors or one of these fish absolutely has the potential to apply to other fish to advance the industry further. Okay, thank you all.